At dinner, my daughter-in-law mocked me in front of everyone. That old woman is nothing but a retired loser. Then, my granddaughter's fiancé asked, "So, what did you do for a living?" I answered with a single word, and it sent a chill through every single guest at the table. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from. That way, I can see just how far my story has traveled. My name is Rose, and I'm 62 years old. For the last 8 years, I've been living a lie. Not because I've lied, but because I've allowed others to build a false version of who I am. That night, in the dining room of my own home, as I watched my daughter-in-law, Julia, serve dessert with that smile that never quite reached her eyes, I knew the time had come for the truth to be revealed. The table was full. My son Michael, my daughter-in-law Julia, my 23-year-old granddaughter Chloe, with her fiancé James, and a few close family friends. It was Chloe's engagement dinner, an occasion that should have been perfect. I had spent days preparing everything with care. The fine china I inherited from my mother, fresh flowers from the garden, the menu I knew Chloe loved. But from the moment Julia walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. She had that look I knew all too well, an expression that said she had come prepared for a fight. Over the past few years, I had learned to read her moods like someone reading the weather before a storm. It all started when James, a polite 25-year-old who worked in marketing, innocently asked about the photographs on the fireplace mantel. They were old pictures, some in black and white, from my college days and the early years of my career. "Are these yours, Mrs. Miller?" James asked, holding a photo where I looked much younger, dressed in a formal suit. Before I could answer, Julia let out a laugh that cut through the air like a knife. "Oh, James, don't bother with those old photos. They're from when Rose pretended to be someone important." I felt the air in the room grow thick. Michael, my son, said nothing. He never said anything when his wife attacked me like that. Chloe looked down, clearly uncomfortable. The other guests exchanged nervous glances. "Pretended to be?" I repeated quietly, more to myself than to anyone else. Julia settled into her chair, clearly enjoying the moment. "Well, you know what I mean, all those stories about your brilliant career, but look at you now. You're just a retired old woman living off her pension." The words landed on the table like stones. James looked confused. Chloe was mortified. And me. I just took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time Julia had publicly humiliated me. For years I had endured her hurtful comments, her small cruelties disguised as jokes, all to keep the family peace. "A retired loser," Julia continued, her voice now louder, more confident. "That's what Rose is. Someone who lives in the past because she never achieved anything real in the present." The silence at the table was deafening. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. For years, I had chosen to stay silent, swallowing the pain and humiliation. I had decided that keeping the family together was more important than defending my dignity. It was then that James, bless his innocent heart, asked the question that would change everything. "I'm sorry, but what did you do for a living, Mrs. Miller? I mean, before you retired?" Julia laughed again. "Oh, James, get ready for another fantastic story. Rose always has tall tales about how important she was." I looked my daughter-in-law directly in the eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to be quiet, to smooth things over, to avoid conflict. Something inside me had broken that night, but something had also been set free. "A judge," I said simply. The word landed like a gavel on marble. Julia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. James blinked several times. Chloe looked up, stunned. Michael finally looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a long time. "I'm sorry," Julia murmured, but her voice had lost all its earlier arrogance. "I was a judge," I repeated, my voice firmer now. "A district judge for 32 years. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the awkward silence of humiliation, but the heavy silence of shock, of the dawning recognition of a colossal mistake. James set his wine glass down on the table as carefully as if it were made of spun glass. "A district judge, as in federal court?" I nodded slowly. "Among other places." Julia had turned visibly pale. I could see her mind racing, trying to process this information that completely changed the context of all her previous attacks. Chloe was the first to speak. "Grandma, why did you never tell us this?" I looked at her with affection. My granddaughter had always been sweet to me, but even she had started to treat me like the irrelevant old woman Julia had painted in their minds. "Because I thought keeping the peace in the family was more important than keeping my pride," I answered honestly. Michael finally found his voice. "Mom, I remembered something about the courthouse, but I just thought you'd exaggerated the details over the years." There it was, the confession that my own son had chosen to believe his wife's version of me over my own, that he had decided I was someone who made up stories to feel important, rather than someone who had chosen silence to protect his feelings. Julia tried to regain control. "Well, if you were so important, why do you live so modestly? Why don't you have more evidence of this supposed career?" I looked at her for a long moment. There were so many things I could have said about how I had donated a large part of my savings to charities, about how I had chosen a modest house because real value wasn't in material possessions, about how I had opted for a simple retirement because I had seen too much of the corruption that comes with power. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I just smiled. "Because I chose to live this way, Julia. There's a difference between not being able to and not wanting to." The rest of the dinner passed in a tense quiet. The guests left early, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had invaded the celebration. James said goodbye to me with a new respect in his eyes. Chloe hugged me tighter than usual. When we were finally alone, Michael and Julia went home without saying much more. But I could see in Julia's eyes that something had fundamentally changed. She no longer saw me as the harmless old woman she had been attacking for years. That night, as I washed the dishes in my quiet kitchen, I realized I had crossed a line from which there was no return. For years, I had kept my past buried for the sake of my family. But now that I had started to speak, I knew I could never be silent again. What Julia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that being a judge hadn't just been a job for me. It had been my identity, my passion, my life. And there were cases, decisions, moments in that career that even I hadn't fully processed. As I dried the last plate, a small but determined smile crossed my face. Julia had wanted a war. Now she was going to find out exactly who she had been messing with all these years. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my favorite armchair, the same one where I used to study cases late into the night when I was still working, remembering how I had gotten to this point, how I had allowed my own daughter-in-law to turn me into a shadow of who I really was. It all began 8 years ago when Michael announced he was marrying Julia. From the first moment, I knew she saw me as a threat. Not because I was interfering or controlling, but because my very presence challenged the narrative she wanted to build for her new marriage. I vividly remember the first time Julia visited my house. It was a Sunday afternoon, 3 months before the wedding. Michael had asked me to make my famous roast beef, the same one I had perfected over the years for special family dinners. I had spent hours in the kitchen, wanting to make a good impression on the woman my son had chosen. "Your house is interesting," Julia had said, looking around the living room with an expression I couldn't quite read as curiosity or disdain. Her eyes stopped on my law library, the leather-bound volumes that took up an entire wall. Rose collects books, Michael explained, as if it were a quaint hobby instead of the tools of a 3-decade career. Have you read all of them? Julia asked, touching one of the spines with the tip of her finger. Most of them, I replied. They were necessary for my work. Your work? Her tone had shifted subtly. Michael told me you worked in government offices. I looked at my son, confused. Government offices? Michael avoided my gaze. Well, technically the judicial system is part of the government, isn't it? It was in that moment that I understood. Michael had downplayed my career to Julia, reducing 32 years of service on the bench to a generic office job. And when I tried to correct that impression, when I started to explain that I had been a judge, Julia interrupted me with a sweet smile. How interesting. Michael didn't mention you were so ambitious. The word ambitious came out of her mouth as if it were something slightly unpleasant, as if there were something improper about a woman of my generation having serious professional aspirations. Over the following months, I watched as Julia systematically minimized my past in family conversations. When someone asked about my career, she would answer before I could. Oh, Rose worked for the county, she would say with a smile that invited no further questions. You know how those government jobs are. Lots of paperwork. At first, I tried to correct these inaccurate descriptions, but every time I did, Julia would respond with comments that made me seem boastful or exaggerated. Rose tends to be a bit dramatic, she once told Michael's sister during a family gathering. It's understandable. After people retire, many of them embellish their memories of how important they were at their jobs. The implication was clear. I was a delusional old woman making up grand stories about a mundane past. And the most painful part was that Michael never defended me. He just remained silent, allowing his wife to rewrite my history. During the first year of their marriage, I tried to maintain my place in the family. I hosted Sunday dinners, remembered birthdays, offered help when Chloe was born. But gradually, Julia began to build subtle barriers between my granddaughter and me. Chloe is very busy with school, she would tell me, when I called to invite my granddaughter to spend time with me. Maybe next week. Next week never came. When Chloe turned 15, I suggested we could do something special together. Maybe a weekend trip to the city to see a Broadway show. Chloe had shown an interest in theater since she was little, and I had contacts who could get good tickets. That's very generous of you, Rose, Julia had said. But we already have family plans. Besides, Chloe is at an age where she prefers to spend time with kids her own age, not with, well, you understand. I didn't understand. Or rather, I understood perfectly, but I didn't want to admit it. Julia was painting me as the irrelevant, boring grandmother that teenagers naturally avoid. The cruelest part was how she did it all. There were never direct confrontations, never open insults, just a constant, systematic erosion of my place in the family. Seemingly innocent comments that, accumulated over the years, had created an image of me as someone who had perhaps been marginally important in the past, but was now just an old woman with a tendency to exaggerate. Rose always has interesting stories about her workdays, she had told a neighbor during a barbecue in my backyard. She has a very vivid imagination for someone her age. By the time Chloe got to college, I had become a peripheral figure in my own family. My granddaughter loved me, but she saw me through the lens Julia had carefully constructed. As a sweet but somewhat eccentric grandmother who lived on probably inflated memories of a career that had never been as important as she remembered. The breaking point had come 2 years ago during Chloe's college graduation. I had wanted to give her something special, something that reflected my pride in her academic achievements. I had considered giving her my law books, some of them valuable first editions, thinking that maybe she would follow in my footsteps in the law. When I mentioned this idea during a family dinner, Julia had laughed softly. "Oh, Rose, that's very sweet, but Chloe is studying graphic design. I don't think she'll need dusty old law books." "Dusty?" I had repeated, feeling the insult like a slap. "Well, you know what I mean. They're very specialized books for someone who doesn't work in government offices." There it was again, that deliberate reduction of my career to something generic and insignificant. That night, after Michael and Julia left, I had stayed up until dawn, looking at my library. Each of those books represented years of study, complex cases, decisions that had affected real lives. I had interpreted constitutional law, presided over trials that set precedents, navigated delicate political situations that required not just legal knowledge, but a deep understanding of human nature. But to my own family, all of that had been reduced to office work. It was after that night that I made the conscious decision to stop correcting Julia's false impressions. I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my pride, that being the beloved, albeit marginalized grandmother was better than being the problematic mother-in-law who caused tension in my son's marriage. For 2 years, I lived that lie. I let Julia tell her version of my story. I allowed my granddaughter to grow up thinking her grandmother was an ordinary retiree with nostalgia for a past she had probably exaggerated over time. But that night, sitting in my armchair as the early morning slowly approached, I realized something fundamental. By choosing silence to preserve family peace, I hadn't protected anything. I had allowed my own family to lose respect for me, to see me as someone whose opinions and experiences held no real value. And Julia, my dear daughter-in-law, who had orchestrated all this with the precision of a surgeon, was about to find out that she had been playing with fire all these years. Because there were aspects of my career, specific cases, decisions I had made that would completely change her perception of who I really was. And now that I had started to speak, there was no stopping what was coming next. The phone rang at 7 a.m. It was Chloe, my granddaughter, and her voice sounded different. It wasn't the shallow, rushed conversation I had become accustomed to over the last few years. There was something new in her tone, a genuine curiosity I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. "Grandma, I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "Can I come over this afternoon?" When she arrived, she brought a laptop and a determined expression that painfully reminded me of myself at her age. She sat on the sofa across from me, opened the computer, and showed me the screen. "I searched your name last night," she said directly. "Rose Miller, and I found a lot of things." My stomach tightened. For years I had managed to keep my past separate from my family life, but the internet has an eternal memory. Chloe read from the screen. "Judge Rose Miller presides over landmark civil rights case. Decision sets national precedent." She looked up at me. "This is from 1997. There are dozens of articles, Grandma. Dozens." I remained silent, watching my granddaughter navigate the archives of my career. I watched her eyes widen with each headline, each photograph of me on the courthouse steps, each mention of cases I had presided over. "It says here, you were the first woman to be appointed to the district court in our state," she continued, her voice now filled with awe. "Why did you never tell us this?" I sighed deeply. "Because I thought it was more important to be your grandmother than to be Judge Miller." Chloe closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "But Grandma, this is incredible. It says here You presided over the Patterson versus State case, the one that changed adoption laws for same-sex couples across the country. The Patterson case. I remembered every detail of those intense weeks in 1998, the death threats I received daily, the political pressure from both sides, the overwhelming responsibility of knowing my decision would affect thousands of families nationwide. It was a complicated case, I said simply. Complicated. Chloe leaned forward. Grandma, you changed the lives of thousands of people. There are testimonials here from families who were able to adopt because of your decision. There's even a documentary about the case where you're mentioned as a civil rights hero. A hero. The word sounded strange, coming from my own granddaughter, when for years I had been treated as an irrelevant old woman with exaggerated stories. Does Mom know about this? Chloe asked, the question I had been dreading. Your mother knows I was a judge, but she was never interested in the details. Chloe frowned. How could she not be interested? Grandma, you're famous. There's a wing of the courthouse named after you. It was true. The Rose Miller Wing for Family Justice had been inaugurated in 2005, 3 years before my retirement. It was one of the greatest honors of my career, but by then, I had already made the decision to keep my professional life separate from my family. Chloe spent the next hour showing me articles she had found, cases I had forgotten, mentions in law journals, photographs from award ceremonies I had attended alone because I didn't want my family to feel obligated to come with me. Look at this, she said, reading from another article. Judge Miller is known for her compassionate yet firm approach in domestic violence cases. Her sentences have become a model for courts in other states. Chloe looked at me with tears in her eyes. Grandma, you saved lives. The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had downplayed my own career. I had accepted Julia's narrative that my work had been ordinary. But hearing my granddaughter read about the real impact of my decisions reminded me of something I had buried. I had been good at my job. Very good. Why did you retire so early? Chloe asked. It says here you could have continued until you were 70. I retired at 54 because I wanted to be present for my family, because Michael had just gotten married, and I thought there might be grandchildren soon, because I believed that being a grandmother was more important than being a judge. I wanted time for my family, I answered honestly. Chloe shook her head slowly. But Grandma, don't you see? You could have had both. You could have been Judge Miller and also our grandmother. She was right, of course, but for years, Julia had made me feel that my career was a barrier between me and my family, that my professional achievements made me intimidating, unreachable, that to be a good mother-in-law and grandmother, I needed to be smaller, more ordinary. That afternoon, after Chloe left, I received an unexpected call. It was James, Chloe's fiancé. Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice formal but respectful. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. Chloe told me about your career, and I wanted to apologize. Apologize for what? For not treating you with the respect you deserved last night. If I had known who you really were, I never would have allowed anyone to treat you that way. His words were well-intentioned, but they bothered me. James, I deserve respect because I am a human being, not because I was a judge. There was a pause. You're right, of course. But Mrs. Miller, what I don't understand is why someone with your history would allow themselves to be treated like that. You confronted dangerous criminals. You challenged corrupt systems. Why didn't you defend yourself last night? It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself, because I thought preserving family harmony was more important than preserving my pride. And now? I looked toward my library, at the photos on the mantels, at the framed awards I had stored in drawers so as not to seem boastful. Now I'm wondering if I was preserving family harmony or simply enabling abuse. That evening, for the first time in years, I took out my professional photo albums, images from swearing-in ceremonies, from important cases, from moments that had defined not only my career, but my identity. There was one photograph in particular that stopped me. It was from 2003, after the Rodriguez versus the City case. I had spent 6 months dealing with systematic corruption in the local police department, facing threats and intimidation. In the photo, I was on the courthouse steps after delivering the sentence, surrounded by reporters and community activists. I looked strong, determined, like someone who would not tolerate being walked over. What had happened to that woman? The phone rang again. This time it was Michael. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "Julia is very upset about last night." "Upset about what?" "She says you humiliated her in front of our friends, that you intentionally withheld information to make her look bad." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. "I humiliated her? Michael, your wife has been humiliating me for 8 years. Mom, that's not the point. The point is that now everything is awkward. Julia feels terrible. And how do you think I've felt for all these years?" There was a long silence. Finally, Michael sighed. "I didn't know you were so important. So important, as if my value as a person depended on my professional title." "Michael, I was always important. I was your mother." But even as I said the words, I realized he didn't understand. For Michael, just like for Julia, my value had been directly tied to my professional status. When I chose to retire, when I chose to be just a grandmother, I had lost their respect without even realizing it. That night, as I prepared for bed, I made a decision. I was not going back to silence. I was not going to let Julia rewrite my history once again. I was not going to pretend to be less than I was to make others feel comfortable. But more importantly, I realized that Julia had made a fatal mistake. For years, she had assumed she knew all my secrets, that she had dug up all the relevant information about my past. She had built her campaign of humiliation based on a shallow understanding of who I had been. What she didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that the cases Chloe had found on the internet were just the tip of the iceberg. There were aspects of my career, decisions I had made, situations I had handled that had never made it to the media, cases that had required a level of strength and resolve that would completely transform her perception of who I really was. And now that I had decided to stop hiding, Julia was about to find out exactly what kind of woman she had been attacking all these years. The call came at 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning. It was my former court clerk, Robert, a man who had worked with me for the last 15 years of my career. "Judge Miller," he said, using the title no one had uttered in my presence for years. "I hope I'm not disturbing you this early, but I have some news I think you'll be interested in." Robert told me they had arrested Edward Vance, the man I had sentenced to life in prison in 2006 for the murder of 3 young women. He had appealed his sentence multiple times, always arguing that I had been biased during the trial. Now, 12 years later, he had confessed to 2 additional murders, completely validating the severity of my original sentence. "The media is going to be contacting you," Robert warned me. "The case is getting national attention again. Vance specifically mentioned that you were the only judge who wasn't intimidated by his threats." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen remembering that case. Edward Vance had not been an ordinary criminal. He was intelligent, manipulative, and had connections that allowed him to exert considerable political pressure. During the trial, I had received anonymous calls at my home. My car had been followed. Black flowers had been sent to my office with threatening notes. The pressure to issue a lighter sentence had come from everywhere. The mayor of the city, who had financial ties to Vance's family, some of my fellow judges, who argued that a harsh sentence would bring too much negative attention to the court. Even some prominent members of the legal community suggested there was insufficient evidence for a life sentence. But I had seen the complete files, spoken with the victims' families, evaluated every piece of evidence, and reached an inescapable conclusion. Edward Vance was a dangerous predator who would kill again if given the chance. The morning after I delivered the sentence, I had found an envelope on my car's windshield. Inside was a photograph of Michael leaving his college campus with a note that read, "Accidents can happen to anyone." That was the first time in my career I felt real fear, not for myself, but for my family. I hired private security for Michael without telling him, changed my daily routines, and for months I lived looking over my shoulder. I never told Michael about the threats. I didn't want him to live in fear. I didn't want him to blame himself for the risks of my job. But that experience taught me something fundamental about myself. When necessary, I could be relentless. The phone rang again. This time it was a reporter from the local newspaper. "Judge Miller, I'm David Chen from the Herald Tribune. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the Vance case and his new confession." I hesitated. For years, I had avoided media attention, had kept a low profile. But something in me had changed after that dinner with Julia. "You can come this afternoon," I told him. David Chen arrived promptly at 2 p.m. He was a young man, probably Michael's age, with a digital recorder and a notebook full of prepared questions. "Judge Miller, many of our younger readers aren't familiar with the original Vance case. Could you explain why it was so controversial?" I settled into my chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the natural authority that came with discussing my professional work. Edward Vance had considerable political and financial influence, I began. His family had generously contributed to local campaigns for decades. There was an implicit expectation that he would receive preferential treatment in the judicial system. And you refused to give it to him? I refused to allow money and connections to influence justice. My job was to protect the community, not to protect the privileged. Chen was taking notes quickly. "I understand you received considerable pressure to issue a lighter sentence." "Pressure would be an understatement," I replied. "I received direct threats against my family. They tried to intimidate me in every way possible." "And did that change your decision?" I looked at him directly. "Mr. Chen, I spent 32 years on the bench. If I had allowed threats to influence my decisions, I wouldn't have lasted 32 days. As I spoke, I could feel that part of me I had buried for years begin to resurface. The authority, the confidence, the absolute certainty in my own moral principles. Chen asked more questions about other cases, about my judicial philosophy, about the impact of being one of the few women on the bench at that time. With each answer, I felt more like the person I had been before I decided to become invisible to please my family. After he left, I sat in my living room thinking about something I had said during the interview. When Chen asked me what advice I would give to young women facing intimidation or pressure to conform, I had replied, "Never make yourself smaller to make others feel comfortable. The world needs your full strength, not a diminished version of who you really are." The words resonated in my own mind. For 8 years, that was exactly what I had done. I had made myself smaller to make Julia comfortable. I had diminished my accomplishments, minimized my experience, pretended to be less intelligent and less capable than I really was. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Chloe. "Grandma, Did you know they're going to interview you on the news tonight? I didn't. Chen had mentioned the article would be in tomorrow's paper, but he hadn't said anything about television. Dad and Mom are watching the news, Chloe continued. Mom looks uncomfortable. That night, Michael and Julia showed up at my door unannounced. Julia had an expression I hadn't seen before, a mixture of nervousness and something that might have been reluctant respect. We saw the interview, Michael said without preamble. And? Julia spoke for the first time. I didn't know you had faced death threats. Her voice was different. It didn't have the condescending tone that had characterized our interactions for years. There was something new there, something that resembled caution. There were a lot of things you didn't know about my career, I replied calmly. Michael cleared his throat. Mom, the reporter mentioned other cases that never made the news. I nodded. My work often involved sensitive information. Not everything could be made public. What kind of information? Julia asked, and I could detect genuine curiosity in her voice for the first time since I'd known her. I looked at both of them for a long moment. For years, I had protected their comfort, keeping certain aspects of my past buried. But after the events of the past week, after years of systematic humiliation, I no longer felt the obligation to protect their feelings. I handled organized crime cases, I said simply. Cases of high-level government corruption. Situations where testifying against the wrong people could result in serious consequences for me and my family. Julia blinked several times. Organized crime? Among other types of cases, yes. During the 90s, our district was a focal point for drug trafficking and money laundering. Many cases required federal protection for the judges involved. Michael had fallen silent, processing this information. He finally spoke. Is that why you retired early? I retired because I wanted to be present for my family, but also because after 3 decades of facing some of the most dangerous situations in the judicial system, I was tired of living with constant threats. Julia seemed to be recalculating everything she thought she knew about me. Why did you never tell us this? I looked at her directly. Because when I tried to talk about my career, you told me I tended to exaggerate. You made me feel that sharing my professional experience was inappropriate bragging. The silence that followed was dense, heavy with years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities. Michael finally broke the silence. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't understand who you really were. I was always who I was, Michael. The difference is that now I'm willing to show it. After they left, I sat in my study, surrounded by the books and documents of my career. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an irrelevant old woman with stories from the past. I felt like Judge Miller again. But there was something more I needed my family to understand. The cases they had discussed that night, the threats I had mentioned, were still only a fraction of the full story. There were decisions I had made, enemies I had made, situations I had navigated that would fundamentally change their understanding, not only of my career, but of who I was as a person. And now that I had started to remind them who I really was, I wasn't going to stop until they fully understood who they had been living with all these years. The call that changed everything came on a Friday morning. It was Patricia Evans, my former colleague from the state Supreme Court, with whom I had kept in sporadic contact since my retirement. Rose, I need your help, she said without preamble. We have a delicate situation, and your experience would be invaluable. Patricia explained that they were handling a judicial corruption case involving 3 judges from the Northern District. They needed someone with experience in high-sensitivity cases to serve as an external consultant, someone whose integrity was beyond question. I know you're retired, she continued, But this case requires exactly the kind of expertise you developed during the Sterling and Hamilton cases in the 90s. The Sterling and Hamilton cases. I hadn't thought about them in years, but Patricia's mention brought everything back with crystal clarity. They had been the most dangerous cases of my career, involving a web of corruption that stretched from local government to international criminal organizations. Patricia, I haven't been active in the system for 8 years. Rose, experience doesn't fade, and frankly, we need someone who isn't afraid to make tough decisions, someone who has proven she can't be intimidated. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, thinking about the proposal. For 8 years, I had lived as if my career was ancient history, as if my skills and experience had expired the day I retired. But Patricia's call reminded me of something fundamental. I hadn't lost my ability to analyze complex situations, to make decisions under pressure, to navigate dangerous political terrain. That afternoon, for the first time in years, I opened my professional files. Not the public documents Chloe had found online, but my personal notes, my private case analyses, the strategies I had developed for handling impossible situations. As I read, I could feel that part of me that had been dormant for so long begin to awaken. The mental clarity, the confidence in my own judgment, the absolute certainty that I could handle any situation that came my way. On Monday morning, I called Patricia and accepted the consultancy. That same afternoon, Julia appeared at my door. She hadn't come alone. She brought Michael with her, and they both had tense expressions. "Rose, we need to talk," Julia said, her voice more serious than I had ever heard it. I invited them in, noticing how Julia looked around my living room as if she were seeing it for the first time. Her eyes stopped on the legal documents I had left on the coffee table, on the professional photographs I had put back on the shelves. "We've been talking," Michael began, "about everything that's happened lately, about the things we didn't know about your career." "And?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Julia cleared her throat. "I wanted to apologize for the comments I made the other night, for the way I've treated you all these years." It was the first time Julia had offered me a direct apology, but there was something in her tone that bothered me. It didn't sound like genuine remorse. It sounded like someone who had recalculated a situation and realized they had underestimated their opponent. "I accept your apology," I said calmly, "but I need you to understand something. The problem wasn't just the comments the other night. The problem has been 8 years of systematically minimizing my experience and my value as a person." Michael intervened. "Mom, we understand that now, and we want to change things." "How?" Julia and Michael exchanged glances. They had clearly rehearsed this conversation. "We want you to be a part of the family again," Julia said, "as you really are, not as I thought you were." The choice of words was revealing. She wasn't apologizing for treating me badly. She was apologizing for misinterpreting who I was, as if the problem had been her lack of information, not her lack of basic respect. "Julia," I said evenly, "what if you had never found out about my professional past?" She hesitated. That's a tough question." "It shouldn't be. A person deserves basic respect regardless of their professional status." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, I think you're being a little hard. Julia is trying to apologize." I looked at him with an expression I hadn't used on him since he was a boy, the look I reserved for defense attorneys trying to justify inexcusable behavior. "Michael, your wife spent 8 years convincing you that I was an old woman with a tendency to exaggerate my own importance. During all that time, you never once stopped to wonder if maybe she was wrong. You never defended your own mother." The silence that followed was heavy. Michael had turned pale, and I could see the exact moment he understood the magnitude of his own complicity in my marginalization. Now, I continued, that you've discovered my career was more significant than you thought. You suddenly want to change things. Don't you see the problem with that? Julia spoke in a small voice. What do you want us to do? The question surprised me. For years, it had been me who adapted, who changed, who made myself smaller to accommodate their needs. Now they were asking me what I wanted. I want you to understand that I don't need your permission to be who I am, I said finally. I want you to acknowledge that the problem was never my tendency to exaggerate, but your tendency to minimize. And I want you to know that if we are going to have a relationship from now on, it will be based on mutual respect, not on your newfound understanding of my resume. Michael nodded slowly. That's fair. But Julia seemed to be struggling with something else. Rose, there's something else I need to ask you. What? Chloe mentioned you accepted a consulting job. Is that true? Yes. Are you going to go back to working regularly? There it was, Julia's real concern. It wasn't just that she had misinterpreted my past. It was that her control over the family dynamic was at risk if I once again became an active, authoritative person in the world. I'm going to do what I see fit, I replied, just as I have done my entire adult life. It's just that Chloe is planning her wedding, and we had thought you could help with what? I interrupted. With the tasks you consider appropriate for a retired grandmother, baking cakes and folding napkins. Julia blushed. I didn't mean it like that. But that's exactly what you meant. You're comfortable with me being Judge Miller in retrospect, but you don't want me to be an active, authoritative person in the present. I stood up from my chair, feeling all the authority I had developed over 3 decades on the bench. Listen to me carefully, both of you. For 8 years, I made myself smaller to preserve family harmony. That is over. From now on, I am going to live as the person I truly am, do the work that satisfies me, and make the decisions I see fit. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine. Michael and Julia left shortly after, clearly disturbed by this new version of me, who was unwilling to soften my edges for their comfort. That night, I called Patricia to confirm my participation in the corruption case. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I called some of my old colleagues to catch up on recent developments in constitutional law. With each conversation, I could feel that authoritative, confident part of myself growing stronger. It wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. On Wednesday night, I got a call from Chloe. Grandma, Dad, and Mom said you're going back to work. I'm going to be doing some consulting work, yes. Does that mean you won't have time for us? Her question broke my heart, but it also gave me clarity. Chloe, honey, I will never have less time for you. What has changed is that I am no longer going to pretend to be less than I am to make others feel comfortable. I don't understand. It means I'm going to be your grandmother and Judge Miller. You're going to have a grandmother who bakes cakes and also a grandmother who consults on complex legal cases. Does that bother you? Chloe laughed. Grandma, that sounds amazing. I always wanted a superpowered grandma. Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years, but they also reminded me of something crucial. All this time, I had been protecting my family from a version of myself that had never been threatening to them. It had only been threatening to Julia, who had seen my competence and experience as a threat to her own position in the family hierarchy. After hanging up with Chloe, I sat in my study surrounded by my law books, my case notes, my professional photographs. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't feel like an old woman living in the past. I felt like an experienced woman who was ready to write the next chapter of her life. But there was one last thing I needed my family to fully understand, and that understanding would come when they realized that the woman who had been living among them all these years was not a diminished version of who she had been professionally. She was the same person with the same skills, the same determination, and the same strength she had used to face some of the most dangerous situations in the judicial system. The difference was that now she had no intention of hiding that strength for anyone's comfort. 6 months later, I was standing at the podium of the State Convention Center, addressing an audience of 300 lawyers and judges at the annual Justice Conference. The topic of my presentation was Navigating Systemic Corruption, Lessons from 3 Decades on the Bench. In the front row, to my surprise and deep satisfaction, sat Michael, Chloe, and James. Julia had decided not to attend, citing a scheduling conflict, but her absence no longer bothered me. I had learned to distinguish between those who truly wanted to be present in my life and those who simply couldn't handle my full authenticity. The most challenging case of my career, I said into the microphone, my voice resonating with the authority I had reclaimed, was not a murder case or an organized crime case. It was learning to trust my own judgment when everyone else was telling me I was wrong. I told the story of the Hamilton case from 1998, when I had uncovered evidence that the mayor was facilitating money laundering operations through fictitious municipal contracts. The pressure to ignore the evidence had come from everywhere: judicial superiors, community leaders, even veiled threats from criminal organizations. I learned that integrity isn't something you have or don't have, I continued. It's something you choose, moment by moment, decision by decision. And sometimes the hardest decision is to maintain your integrity when the people closest to you ask you to compromise it for their comfort. After the presentation, Chloe came up to me with tears in her eyes. "Grandma, I had no idea how strong you were." "I was always this strong, honey. The difference is that now I no longer hide it." Michael had been unusually quiet throughout the conference. He finally approached me as I was packing up my materials. "Mom, I have to ask you something." "Go on." "Will you ever forgive me for not defending you all those years?" The question stopped me. For months, I had been so focused on reestablishing my own authority that I hadn't fully considered the emotional impact on Michael. I could see in his eyes that he truly understood the magnitude of his lack of support. "Michael, I've already forgiven you, but more important than my forgiveness is that you learn from this. Your wife won't be the last person in your life who tries to convince you to diminish someone else for their benefit." He nodded slowly. "Julia and I have been in therapy." That surprised me. "Really?" She finally admitted that she knew exactly who you were from the beginning. She had researched your career before we got married, but she decided it would be easier to marginalize you than to compete for influence in the family. The honesty of this admission was both validating and painful. It confirmed what I had suspected. Julia's attacks had been calculated and deliberate, not innocent misunderstandings. "And how do you feel, knowing that?" I asked. Michael looked tired, betrayed, manipulated, like I've been living a lie for 8 years. "What are you going to do?" "We're working on it, but one thing is clear. I will never again let someone convince me to ignore my own judgment about the people I love." 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation. Chloe and James asked me to officiate their wedding ceremony. In our state, retired judges retain the authority to perform ceremonies, and Chloe had decided she wanted her grandmother to marry her. The wedding took place in a beautiful garden on the outskirts of the city. It was a small, intimate ceremony, exactly what Chloe had wanted. As I stood before the bride and groom, dressed in my judicial robe that I hadn't worn in 8 years, I could feel the weight of the responsibility and the honor. Marriage, I began, looking at Chloe and James, is not just a promise between two people. It is a promise to see and value your partner completely, not just the parts you find comfortable or convenient. My words were directed at the bride and groom, but I could see how they resonated with everyone present. Julia was sitting in the second row, avoiding my gaze. Michael watched me with a mixed expression of pride and remorse. After the ceremony, during the reception, James approached me. "Judge Miller, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me what kind of woman Chloe really is. Seeing how you reclaimed your strength and authority, I have a better understanding of the strength that lives in my wife, too." His words touched me deeply. One of the most satisfying things over the last few months had been seeing how my example had inspired Chloe to be more assertive in her own life, to not apologize for her intelligence and ambition. Later that night, as I was cleaning up after the celebration, Julia approached me. We had spoken little in recent months, maintaining a distant but functional politeness. "Rose, can we talk?" I nodded, preparing myself for another tense conversation. "I'm not expecting an elaborate apology or a dramatic reconciliation," she began. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now why what I did was so devastating. I spent 8 years stealing your identity, not your professional identity, but your right to exist fully in your own family." It was the most profound understanding I had heard from her. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," she continued, "because I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I've learned something important. Trying to make someone else smaller never makes you bigger. It just makes you cruel." I looked at this woman who had caused so much pain in my life, and I realized I no longer felt anger toward her. I didn't feel love or affection, but I didn't feel hatred either. I felt a kind of distant peace. "I accept what you're telling me," I replied, "and I hope you use this understanding to treat other people better in the future." A year later, my new life had found its rhythm. I worked as a consultant on high-sensitivity cases 3 days a week. The other days I dedicated to writing a book on judicial ethics, spending time with Chloe and James, and enjoying activities I had put off for decades. My relationship with Michael had gradually healed. He and Julia had made real progress in therapy, and while our family dynamic would never be the same, it was more honest and healthier now. Chloe had started visiting me regularly, not as an obligated granddaughter, but as a young woman who genuinely enjoyed her grandmother's company. We talked about everything: her career, her ambitions, the challenges of navigating a world that sometimes expected women to be smaller than they really were. One Sunday afternoon, as Chloe and I were having tea in my garden, she asked me a question that made me reflect. "Grandma, do you ever regret waiting so long to be yourself again?" I considered the question carefully. I don't have regrets, because every experience taught me something valuable. I learned that keeping family peace at the cost of your own dignity preserves nothing real. I learned that some people will only respect you when they understand you don't need their approval to live fully. And what did you learn about yourself? I smiled, looking toward my house, where my law books were once again in prominent places, where my professional photographs decorated the walls, where I no longer apologized for the space I took up in the world. I learned that I had never lost my strength. I had only chosen not to use it. And that there's a big difference between choosing to be kind and allowing yourself to be treated badly. Chloe nodded, taking mental notes that I knew she would apply in her own life. As the sun set over my garden, I felt completely at peace for the first time in years. not because I had gotten revenge on Julia, but because I had finally reclaimed my own story, and in doing so, I had given my family the chance to truly know the woman who had been there all along,